So, first, I'll just say for me, I've not done these types of collaborations, mostly because they seem really hard. But I'm curious how you all met. Like, how did you come to be in partnership? How did you meet?
Well, first of all, I'm so honored that Charles is here with us today. Charles is a brilliant strategic thinker who walks in really sacred shoes in the civil rights movement in Mississippi, and I just feel honored that you're with us at Stanford. So I don't know how we got here, but I'm glad it happened. Thanks to y'all for making it happen. I mean, the short answer of how we met is actually a nice little parable of how I think Mississippi has done civil rights work for a long time, which is that it has to kind of reach past its state legislature and reach into national social networks to solve hard problems. And after the water crisis, which I think can give us a vivid picture of what that was like within Jackson, but this terrible crisis took place, and this extraordinary civil rights activist, a lifetime civil rights activist named Frank Figures, mobilized his social networks that traveled through a Stanford alum to travel to a Stanford staff member to travel to me. And I was able to do something little, but then I fell in love with Jackson, and they haven't been able to get rid of me ever since. But that's how Mississippi has been solving problems for 100 years. And so I feel like it's very emblematic of the sort of beautiful mobilization of outside resources to really leverage the talent and capacity of folks in Jackson.
So, I'm happy you fell in love. And Mississippi is a complicated state. And like many southern cities, Jackson in particular does not have a good relationship with state government. So, Charles, I'd like you to say a little bit about why that matters and how that shows up.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone, and we'll be remiss if I didn't thank Michelle for the invitation. Happy to be here, bringing a little piece of Southern hospitality. I guess before I begin, I would be remiss if I didn't also mention, I think William Faulkner said it best. If you want to understand the world, you first must understand a place like Mississippi. The reason why I say that is because Mississippi is a place that I find that is home. I love it. I have pride for it, but it definitely has its problems. And so as I talk about the problems, I don't want you to leave here thinking, oh, Mississippi is a place that I may not want to visit. Recognize it's a place with rich history, but also very troubling problems. And so as we talk about that dichotomy between Mississippi and the city of Jackson, Jackson is the capital city for Mississippi. So to give a little bit of context, Mississippi is a state of 3 million people. The largest city is Jackson. Jackson now has 155,000 residents. Growing up, it had more like 225,000 residents. The metro area of Jackson is about 650, maybe close to 700,000. So I just wanted to kind of give that context in terms of people. Now, as we talk about the relationship between the state of Mississippi and the city of Jackson, and how difficult that relationship has been, I would say, over the past 35 or so years. To tell that story, you first have to understand that Jackson is a city that's 82% African American. That was not always the case. Jackson's always had a large African American population, but our first African American mayor was elected in '97. But even prior to '97, the state of Mississippi saw the writing on the wall and saw that the day would come where there would be black leadership in Jackson, and they began to divest. And so as we talk about the water crisis, it was something that at its height or at its pinnacle, you all saw in national news a few years ago, but just growing up, water has always been an issue in Jackson. Just quickly thinking about that, if we look at the last 25 years, the state has only funded water infrastructure for Jackson 3 of those 25 years. And so, you're talking about your largest city and that level of divestment. I know we're going to dive into it deeply.
Can you just say a little bit more, so maybe not everyone knows what the water crisis is? Can you just say what the water crisis is in Jackson?
Oh yeah, I'll try to do it as quick as I can. So basically, what happened a couple of years ago is Jackson water was undrinkable for several weeks, and so the couple things happened in it. Jackson has a complicated system as it relates to the surface water and the drinking water, but what happened is our aging infrastructure was crumbling at the time that we were also losing talent in order to deal with the water crisis. And even the previous mayor did an assessment and said that, we need to address this issue. It's about $1 billion issue. Now we estimated more like a $1.5 billion issue. Otherwise, Jackson will continuously have these boil water notices. So boil water notices in Jackson is something that was routine, but we had a crisis for, I think, close to a month or so, where residents in the Jackson could not drink the water, and in some places the pressure was very low to little.
So, I mean, that's so much. So 600,000 people, more than 600,000 people did not have access to drinking water.
Yeah, so, in thinking of that is basically the residents of Jackson and a small piece of the suburbs. So you're probably talking less than 200,000 that did not have access to water, drinking water.
And so, Michelle, for you, when you think about the complex relationship between the state of Mississippi and Jackson and the divestment in Jackson that Charles is describing, how does that prevent Jackson from solving like complex problems that it faces?
Yeah, I mean, I think cities have to have three things to solve their problems. They have to have authority, capacity, and resources. And if you don't have those three things, then it's very hard to do the basic things that cities do, whether it's provide basic services like water or trash pickup or these kinds of heartland services that we take for granted, or to regulate in ways that try to prevent significant problems. So in Jackson, the homicide rate means that gun control legislation is something that the city has really looked toward and tried to solve a lot of problems of gun shows in town. And so you need authority to try to use your regulatory tools to get at behavior that you're trying to change in the city. And the city also wants the ability to draw in resources from outside, whether it's the federal government supporting kids for summer lunch money or, healthcare funding. And Jackson is also blocked in being able to mobilize those outside resource channels. So I think this larger problem in Jackson is a story of divestment in the nuts and bolts infrastructure, as Charles captured, but also in the ability of the city to sort of rely on its own people and its own leadership to solve its hardest problems. And, we're sitting here at the launch of a racial justice center, and I think this is an example of a problem where you cannot separate race from the issue of that divestment. And that moment, that historical fulcrum that Charles captured when the first Black city council member was elected and then the first Black mayor, in my legal historical timeline of Jackson, that is the beginning of this legal divestment in Jackson's power. So it's very hard to understand that gutting of Jackson's authority, without understanding what's going on in the racial politics of the city's elections.
Yeah. And Charles, I'd love to hear a little bit more about how race plays into this, because the dynamic between blue cities and red states is obviously not unique to Mississippi, right? You have that in a lot of places in the South where the urban areas, like the cities, are actually liberal leaning, Democratic leaning, but the state that surrounds them is very conservative. So how does race complicate that dynamic, or is separate from that dynamic? Can you say a little bit more about race?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to answer twofold. When I was fresh out of college, I had this job where basically I would go down to the Capitol and I would report on the bills that were being proposed, introduced, et cetera. And so the two committees I focused on the most were Ways and Means and Appropriations. And so, as a college student, I felt and as a person who grew up in Mississippi, I felt that race and systemic racism was very deeply rooted in our history, but I couldn't quite pinpoint it to a dollar until I picked up the general fund budget for the state of Mississippi, and I looked page after page, millions of dollars after millions of dollars, penny after penny, where it literally would define, like, here's where we're going to spend our dollars. And here's where, Jackson was not getting his lion's share. Here's where cities in the Mississippi Delta was not getting their lion's share. And so, but in that, our mayor now is Chokwe Antar Lumumba Jr. When Chokwe Lumumba Sr., his father was mayor a little over a decade ago, the legislator was saying, okay, Mississippi is a poor state. So folks who are working downtown, they're working because of government, and there's not enough revenue coming into the city, but folks in the suburbs are just coming in and out and not contributing to the road repair. So the legislators wanted to have tolls, and we were told no. Well, you can't have a toll, but you can impose a 1% sales tax on yourself. And so 90% of the Jackson residents voted to impose a 1% sales tax for infrastructure. And part of it could have gone to water infrastructure. Once it passed, then the state of Mississippi said, okay, well, we're going to create a 1% sales tax commission to tell the city of Jackson how to use the 1% sales tax that they impose on themselves, because majority white residents were coming into the city and not contributing to the infrastructure. And so these are just very technical points of, ways of preemption that happen at every turn. Even when Jackson residents say, you know what, we're going to do more, the state of Mississippi will then in turn say, we'll take the more and we'll be more extractive to that process. And so, I can name a couple all day.
And so turning to like solutions. So I'm curious, when your collaboration, like, how are you looking to address the issues that you've raised?
I'm just looking for excuses to work with Charles Taylor. And two incredibly important HBCUs that are located in Jackson State University and Tougaloo College, that themselves are sacred parts of American history. They are their own kind of institutions that are worth preserving as our national heritage of civil rights and Black self-governance and these, incredibly valuable virtues. And so it's a nice opportunity to get a chance to work with some students at those colleges and with Charles's office. And we are in early formation to figure out exactly the work that we're going to do together. But the original idea comes from an observation that I've had that we had fun talking about in Jackson, which is that the state and local governments don't use the same base facts. And part of the problem is because the state talks in terms of political partisanship, and Jackson experiences the world in terms of the racial history of the state. And that misalignment is very profound. And then there's just these deep wells, I would say intergenerational wells of mistrust that, run across those racial lines. And so one thing I notice as a white woman from Stanford, sort of pass across these boundaries is that the facts on either side are actually quite different. The sort of memories of how we got to this place of dysfunction and acrimony are quite different. And so the daydream that we started to have together was to work with JSU students and Tougaloo students to sort of memorialize some of this history, the origin story of the Constitution itself is sort of deeply expressive of a lot of these problems, but then all the way up to very contemporary issues like the sales tax and self-governance over the airport and all these modern fights. So the idea is to actually do, in mediation, the basic assumption is that if parties who are polarized don't have the same facts, they can't actually proceed. And so part of the idea is to help use local students to sort of build that reservoir of shared information, and then to be able to compare Jackson to Montgomery and other southern capitals where other state legislatures are actually investing and freeing their capital cities in ways that Jackson has not experienced. So, maybe that's what we'll do, but, Charles is in charge. We'll adapt.
Yeah, so that was my next question. Charles, what are your hopes for like the collaborative work that you're doing with Michelle?
And thank you for the question. One, I'm truly enthused about the work, and just kind of echoing Michelle's sentiment. What we've always had to do in Jackson is figure out these workarounds. So, thinking about the water crisis, one piece of hope, because I talked a lot of despair, is, of course, as the country is designed, we are state-centered. And so what we were able to do, because of we were able to explain, here's the historical and structural discrimination towards Jackson, is through the Omnibus Bill a few years ago. And special shout out to Congressman Thompson. And if some of y'all might be familiar with him, he was the chairman of the January 6th Select Committee. So he's my congressman. He was able to secure $600 million for the Jackson water crisis, as well as through the administration, the Biden administration, additional $200 million. So the city of Jackson has had about $800 million to fix the issue. So we're halfway there. Part of the way we're able to work around is that we had to go into federal conservatorship, which we much rather do that than the state conservatorship, which was proposed to us. But saying it to say that was a workaround. And so as I think about what Michelle just mentioned and how we can partner together, it's the biggest piece of it was telling the story. We had to give, here's fact after fact after fact as to why the state is not being a good actor. And so I think about it two ways. One, this narrative piece, because I think it's going to be really important for Jackson residents because they're frustrated. And oftentimes it's very easy to say, well, this is a local leadership issue. I've seen local leadership for the last 30 years, but being able to succinctly tell the story to say, no, this is not necessarily about local leadership. This is about, we have a state that sometimes seems like they forget that we're the capital. And let's lay that out 1, 2, and 3 instead of just the sentiment of that. And then secondly, thinking about the students that she mentioned, with the NAACP, we filed a Title VI complaint around the Civil Rights Act as it relates to Jackson. But it's the same thing, kept coming up. We had to have a lot of factual documentation, historical documentation as to why we believe the city has been discriminated towards the state. And so as we look at, because I think very rarely is the Title VI has been used in that kind of manner. And so with the partnership with Michelle and Stanford, let's think about creative ways to use these, laws and et cetera, that we may not have used before to figure out how do we address some of these issues that Jackson's having.
Okay, so maybe there's time for one more question, and for me, and then Q&A. Okay, so I guess my last question is, as you think about the challenges of Jackson, so there are things that are very specific to Jackson, but then there are things that aren't what you would see in other places as well. So I'm curious how you think about connecting what you're learning and what you're trying to, the solutions you're producing in Jackson to other parts of the country.
I'll just say this quickly. I think about this as we talk about preemption, but I also think about this in the concept of how gentrification happens. And, for Jackson right now, what was terrifying is what they're trying to do around metro governing. So they stand in their bedroom communities and saying, okay, we're just going to control the city, whether that be through privatization or regionalized. And so, as Michelle mentioned, the airport, that's another thing. So it's kind of funny that the Jackson Airport, Hawkins Field, which is now for corporate flights, it was built in, I believe, 1928. But the airport, as you know, if you were to fly in commercially, which is named after Medgar Evers, who was the first field secretary for the Mississippi NAACP, was built in 1963. And so the mayor at the time, Alan Thomas, mentioned, he said, I want to thank everyone who helped the airport in the past, but I also want to thank the taxpayers because they're going to do everything. They're going to pay for it in the future. So this is an airport that was paid for by Jackson residents, but the state wants to take it over. And so what they have been proposing is for the suburbs to be able to be a part of an airport authority, even though it was paid for by the city of Jackson. And just a sad story, and this is something that I may have said fairly loud, is during the height of the water crisis, the lieutenant governor came to him and said, look, if you drop this litigation around the airport, we'll help you with the water. Like, we will help you with the water, as if it's not a part of the state of Mississippi.
Extortion. Michelle, what do you?
Yeah, that story is a perfect answer of this, and those kinds of bargains, these kinds of impossible bargains, I think, are unfortunately very common. I mean, there's two ways in which I think your amazing initial quote from Faulkner sort of comes back to answer this question. Mississippi is this just incredible teacher for the South. It's always had that role. And Jackson, to me, is this incredible teacher for the small city Black South. I think there's this distortion in our politics over the red state, blue city conversation that we focus on Nashville and Austin and Charlotte and these like major multiracial capitals that are huge cities. And their fights with their state legislatures are incredibly important. So I'm taking nothing away from that. But I think we have really paid way too little attention to this problem of the small city Black South and this incredible disinvestment in the places where, overall across the South, there is more population, more people, more governments who have sort of lost their power. And so to me, Jackson is this incredible portal back into that problem. So that's one thing that's super important. But also just, I can't help but mention that, Georgia, we now take for granted as a swing state, but Georgia wasn't always a swing state. And if you sit in Charles's office and he goes through his maps of how Mississippi is the next Georgia, it is a totally magical experience. He's a brilliant kind of voting geek, and he'll show you all the numbers and the precincts and exactly how you get there. And if only Californians would spend less on their primaries, Democrats could actually win Mississippi. But which, by the way, makes him the new Stacey Abrams in terms of strategy, so you should get his autograph. But I think it is really important to understand the future of the Black South for federal politics. And, that in Mississippi, that travels through the history of mass incarceration and the felon disenfranchisement that has come through that system. But it also travels through these patterns that Charles was describing of mass white flight. I mean, if you can picture, Charles is young, and yet you said that when you were young, Mississippi lost, or Jackson has lost basically a fourth of its population since Charles was a kid. To lose population that fast is a total fiscal freefall for any city. It's an infrastructure disaster. It's a budget disaster. And so, and I specialize as a scholar in collapsing local governments, and we're going to have a lot of those in the South. So figuring out how to sort of work with an acrimonious situation like Jackson has with Mississippi, I think is a sort of a big public policy problem that's coming down the pipe.
I have a little bit more time, so I have another question for you, Michelle. So as an academic, what is it that you contribute to the
any students in here, that's my main thing I contribute.
So as you think about these collaborations, so this is something we want to support, right? So people I haven't done this kind of work as I think about doing this work. How do you think about being a productive member of the collaborative team? What is it that you bring that's of value into these situations that you clearly care deeply about?
Yeah, I mean, at the beginning I mentioned that I think Jackson lacks resources, authority, and capacity. At Stanford, we have a lot of capacity. And that includes armchair capacity. Like, our students are just so magnificent and powerful. And putting them to work, I mean, honestly, my whole goal is to be a pass-through for student resources, both financial, thank you very much, so that it can go to my community partners, but also student resources and my resources, and to really do some of the homework. I mean, at one point I was sitting in a pub with a state senator, one of the only blue state senators who represents Jackson, and he was just daydreaming about things that he can't prove to his colleagues in the legislature because he doesn't have enough, time and lawyers and labor to just root around in Alabama's government to sort of show an analogy. We can do that here. And, I think Stanford had this beautiful history of, and to this day still does, of showing up for places and people, way beyond our borders. And so I think I'm just, trying to continue in that tradition. And as an example of that, Mr. Figures, who's the amazing activist who initially called me into Jackson, he texted me at one point with this incredible Mississippi Today investigative journalism piece that busted a neighboring sheriff for incredible racial violence in the neighboring county against Black youth. And he thanked me for this, except that I had nothing to do with this. This was our journalism program at Stanford that had done this just incredible collaboration with Mississippi Today. I was honored to share a business card with Stanford University at that moment, but we have a lot of capacity here, and it's all about, deploying it elsewhere, I think.
And Charles, what is your hope for the collaboration as you think about bringing Stanford, getting them involved? I mean, because we're quite a ways from Mississippi. So you have these people from the outside coming in. Like, what's your hope for how that, helps you move forward the issues that you care about?
Well, one, I invite all of you to come to Mississippi. I can guarantee you a good time and good food. So my hope is for more people to come to Mississippi and for folks to also recognize that even if you're in California or if you're in New York, you cannot ignore the South, because as soon as you ignore the South, it will begin to have implications on your lives, good or bad. I wish we had more time. I could give several examples to that. But what I hope is that people feel the connectivity between California and Mississippi, so much so in a way that they recognize that Mississippi has a lot to offer to them as they have a lot to offer to it. And I'm just really hopeful and optimistic about the collaboration. And I also would love to see, like you said, the students from Stanford and the students from Jackson State and Tougaloo, there be some connective path between those institutions.
And what kind of support do you need to make this collaboration successful? I'll ask that for both of you. I'll start with Michelle.
Well, Stanford Impact Labs has already been amazing at at thinking through some of the larger partnership techniques. And, the truth is that I've done a lot of community-based research for the book that Zocalo, was mentioned. Lots of really embedded reporting and writing in which I felt like I was curating sort of local voices and really tried to do that. But this partnership is different and harder in the sense that I really do mean it, that I want to kind of defer to local partners and really pass through Stanford capacity to support their work and be kind of behind the scenes in it. And that's hard, as Sybil Diver and others who do participatory research in this room know that it's hard for academics to get out of the way and sort of make things happen for others, and that work takes longer. It is, but when I think about writing some kind of history of the state and local relationship in Jackson and doing it without local college students, I am 100% sure that work would not matter. It would be some PDF or some glossy report that would sit in some inbox or on a shelf. It wouldn't matter to anybody. Doing this slowly, sort of through Charles's networks through, Mr. Figure's networks through the colleges will mean that whatever we do might actually matter to people and come to life as a living part of policymaking within Jackson. So I think that's my hope. And yeah.
And just kind of echoing that, I would also say we need time to think, and we need resources to think. Oftentimes in Jackson, it's crisis after crisis after crisis. So having partners who have that time, who have the resources to really think through, because what we're battling is big ideas, and the implications of them, like you said, is not just about Jackson. It has impact on any state where you have a red state, blue city. And so I know it's maybe a bit ambiguous, but thinking resources, I would say, starting there.
So let me pause and actually see if there are any questions from the audience. Yes, you can just call it out. It's okay.
I'm very curious something that you all mentioned as the importance of creating a shared foundation of facts in order to move ahead when you're mediating between groups. And I'm curious, what have you found to be effective in doing that? Because I think that's kind of a larger question of so many of the issues we have today.
A couple things. You were talking about Rankin County. Yeah. So the journal. Sorry. What Michelle had talked about in terms of laying out what happened in Rankin County. So Rankin County is a neighboring county to Hinds County, which is where Jackson is situated. DOJ just opened up a patent of practice investigation. They only have 12 of these across the country, and they put a lot of resources in them. We've been begging them to do it for quite some time. When we were able to show them overwhelming evidence that this is happening, they opened that investigation. And so that's just one example I could give to how showing the evidence and research and the chronology of it. Sorry, will help. And so things like that. Just a quick example.
Yeah, I mean, it was journalists who really, broke that story and really, laid out this history of evidence so beautifully in a way that I think validated what people, like you said, had known for a long time. This is not shocking to anybody in Jackson. What's different about it is that it's being kind of proven and laid out in a way that outsiders can sort of understand. And I would say that it also, that a lot of state and local problems in this kind of setting, I think, come from blame over corruption. It really is this root mistrust that the origin of the management problems is mismanagement and corruption as opposed to a lack of resources. And, from where I sit, Mississippi pointing the finger at Jackson is, as my grandma would say, a little bit rich given Mississippi's own history of corruption. But it is, at some level, all of those facts have to be put on the table of sort of what were those corruption scandals about? What were they worth? What are we talking about? Because my experience of doing a lot of work in Detroit is that many of the things that became kind of signature corruption scandals that Detroit became known for are rounding errors compared to the scale of the problems that were happening structurally in the city of Detroit. And so I think these are things that you have to actually put numbers on and, put in front of people. And again, I could do that all day alone in my office in Stanford, and it wouldn't make any difference in the world. So I think it's more about sort of activating, gathering those facts, being honest about the serious concerns that Mississippi might have, and then activating those facts to be part of a real conversation in the city so that they're not just technical kind of inert things that sit out in the world. And journalists do this so beautifully through narrative. They sort of teach people to care. And, and that's how I learn in the world too. Charles and others have made me care. And so we have to write and tell stories back in a way that teach the next person to care and sort of pass that narrative baton so that people think about, this kind of sales tax problems as rooted in this much more humanistic story of self-governance that has this incredible history in the South.
Another question? Yes.
So speaking of crisis after crisis after crisis, I know that a year or two ago there was an effort by predominantly white state legislators to strip power from locally elected judges in Jackson, replace them with state-appointed judicial circuit. I think I'm describing that right. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? And like, I'm not sure where that case is. Is it, and is there like takeaways? Is it like?
I had that as a note to talk about, but it's it's so much to talk about. So thank you. I'm gonna pay him later. But House Bill 1020. So basically, what happened is the circuit court, which is in Jackson, is elected, or the state of Mississippi is elected. We have 23 judicial districts. Two things happened, and a couple years ago, I think it was about 2016 or so, they created this Capital Complex Improvement District, and the purpose of it, they said, was to just beautify the area around the Mississippi Capitol, and then they expanded the improvement district, but recently they weaponized it, and they did two things. One, they expanded Capitol Police. And so, trying to, quote unquote, address the crime problem in Jackson, they expanded Capitol Police to function, basically, to be able to patrol the downtown area and pretty much the white areas of Jackson that are close to downtown. And then so to put that in context, the city of Jackson has, I think, 250 policemen and about capacity for 300. Capitol Police, I think, was about 75, and recent legislation is proposing for them to be 300. And so that was one piece of it, was to expand Capitol Police that much. I know we close the time, but just digressing for a second, as soon as that expansion went into place, a young black man was killed in his car, no drugs, no weapons, and he was shot in the back of the head while he was still in the car. And, typically we would have been able to have accountability from the city of Jackson, but we do not. And, his mother has yet to see body cam footage, or the state of Mississippi has just been really awful as it relates to sharing any information around that investigation. So that's the kind of danger of this. But the second piece of it was the creation of CCID court, where even though you have Hinds County that has jurisdiction, it was trying to create a new court where there would be new judges, new district attorneys, specifically within this sub-district of Jackson. And so right now the NAACP is in federal court, and so we're still waiting to hear back. Yeah.
Well, we're at time, but I really, really appreciate you all coming, especially you, Charles, flying here. It was incredible. And I wish you all the best on the work. It's really necessary. Thank you for doing the work.